Today, we talked to the founder and CEO of High Ground Service Pros about how he took his HVAC, plumbing, and electrical services company from a small startup to a thriving company with more than 120 employees. I'm Matt Murray, co-publisher and executive editor of Business NH Magazine and Granite Media Group.
And I'm Christine Carrian, co-publisher of Business NH Magazine and chief operating officer for Granite Media Group. And welcome to Bizcast NH.
Christine, so I'm excited to talk to today's guest because it is amazing how far he's taken his company in a short amount of time. And I cannot imagine in 5 years having to hire 120 plus people.
My gosh, I know.
Because we thought it was a big milestone when we hired our third salesperson to join our team of 2 salespeople a year ago. And that was a big milestone for us to cross. It was our first employee since we bought the company, or the first additional
adding to the staff,
adding to the
number of staff. Yeah, exactly.
Say. We had hired people for existing positions, but this is the first time we had hired for an expanded staff position.
Exactly.
And it was a little scary.
It was, because we had, for the magazine traditionally, for quite a while, had just a couple people in the sales role.
Right.
And when I started with the company back in 2006,
2000, yes.
There were 3 or 4 salespeople, and the numbers kind of shifted throughout the years.
Mm-hmm.
There was traditionally, I want to say 3 or so for a good bulk of time, and then it became 2. And then you and I decided that we had one salesperson that was just ready to retire, and
she had decided she was ready to retire.
Yeah. No, she was ready to retire. So we knew, she told us that she was going to be leaving the company. Right. And it gave us the chance to really think about, do we hire somebody else to fill that position? It's kind of the first thought. Or do we kind of take this opportunity to maybe bring on 2 people in that role and see how that can benefit the company. So we've benefit the company and also help serve the territory better that we had. So
right. Better serve our clients that
exactly.
We're in that. This is a rather large
territory. Yeah. So, so far, knock on wood, it's been about a year.
And things are going
well. So far, it's gone well.
Yes.
So,
but I think there's just something when you're an entrepreneur and you're in your startup phase, and even though, Business New Hampshire Magazine's been around for over 40 years, we had just bought the company.
Right, yeah.
And so we had gone from, kind of survival mode and making sure we're keeping the lights on and all that good stuff to, okay, it's now time for us to expand.
Yeah.
And that takes investment and it takes that risk, and you do you go and you crunch the numbers and you talk about, but at the end of the day, you have to decide pull that trigger. And pulling that trigger can be, you're like, close your eyes sometimes. You're like, I know I should be opening and aiming, but I'm just going to close and aim and let's see where it goes.
Well, it's true, because you're taking on that, like you said, additional investment, in you're paying another salary, so you're trying to make sure that all your numbers work out, but that it's going to be a benefit. And
then there's the nightmare of having to go through resumes, and this day and age, you have to go through the job posting sites, and people aren't even paying attention whether or not it's a job they want.
They're just tossing resumes out there.
Right.
Yeah.
So you get flooded sometimes with these resumes. You're like, why would they even be applying for this job? Until you can find those candidates that really are the ones that are worthwhile to bring in. And then there's the whole interviewing process.
Yeah.
And you're like, okay, hopefully this person that I interviewed for this 40 minutes and, are putting their best foot forward, hopefully that's the person who's showing up
right.
when I make this job offer.
Right.
We were lucky in that, and both our candidates did come forward and have done a great job and been great additions to the team. But it is such a nerve-wracking thing when you're expanding to make sure you've got the right people on board who are aligned with your mission, with your own values.
With your culture, yeah.
Yes, and that are you ready then to invest the time and effort to bring them up to speed?
Well, and I think that's the thing we've come across a lot too, is that culture fit is definitely becoming more and more of a priority for folks. And it's, if there's a culture fit, you can always train for the role.
Right.
more or less, depending. Obviously, there are things that are specialties and you need that extra training. But if you know that the person is going to be the right fit to be a part of the organization, and you can train them in the role that they're going to be performing.
Well, especially when you're a small organization like us, you have the wrong fit. It is going to have huge ripple effects for the organization.
Yeah.
If you have someone that's not going to be able to be that team player, it is going to make the life miserable for everyone around them. And then not only do you have the issue with the one employee, you have issues with all your employees.
Right.
Because they're going to be making others unhappy, or things are going to be going wrong that's going to affect team morale if you aren't acting on it.
Yeah. So I'll be interested to talk to our guest today about growing. We grew, like we said, by one position.
He did 120 in 5 years.
So that will definitely be interesting. So I think we should get to know him. What do you think?
Let's do it.
Today's guest is Rich Jordan. Rich is the founder and CEO of High Ground Service Pros, an HVAC, plumbing, and electrical services company operating in New Hampshire and southern Maine. Rich started in the trade in 2020 with just himself and 3 plumbers. 5 years later, High Ground employs over 120 team members across multiple locations. Before building High Ground, Rich served in the United States Marine Corps, where he developed the leadership philosophy that drives his business today. He believes leaders exist to serve their teams and not the other way around. That principle shows up in everything from how High Ground hires to how they promote and develop leaders. The company's mission to give the trades a good home reflects Rich's belief that the trades deserve better infrastructure, better leadership, and better opportunities. High Ground is building that infrastructure one system, one team member, and one customer at a time. Rich, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me, guys.
Congratulations on that phenomenal growth. It's unreal to us, and we have so much to dive into here.
Thank you. It's been a busy few years.
It certainly sounds like it. Yeah, you're probably like, one employee.
That's so quaint.
So I think before we dive in, can you give us a scope of what High Ground does? What are the services that the company offers?
Sure. We're your typical, multi-trade HVAC, plumbing, electrical company. We primarily serve residential customers, but we also do light commercial as well.
And so before you even became an entrepreneur, and we're all about exploring the entrepreneurial journey, because we find that most people, they start at point A and go to Z and then B before they end up here where they are now. You chose to serve your country and going into the service. Can you talk about what led you to that?
To serve?
Yeah.
Well, my family does not consider itself a military family. Mm-hmm. It wasn't something that was pushed on us or anything like that. But when you kind of read the tape, my dad was a naval officer. My grandfather was a Marine. My uncle was a Marine. So we were kids. My brother and I were both kids that grew up understanding the military and understanding the opportunity that exists there. And so I became a Marine infantry officer. My brother became a naval surface warfare officer.
How old were you when you went into the service?
I signed my officer contract when I was a sophomore in college, so I was 19.
And that's a big decision, especially that young. So, I understand. I come from, my dad was Air Force, and again, he wasn't saying, it wasn't like you need to go into the military. He was very foolish to encourage my journalism career. But when you do go to make that decision, what was the light that clicked for you that this is your initial career journey you wanted to take?
I think at the time I was I was an engineering student, mm-hmm. and what I was kind of realizing was hey, I enjoy this math and science and problem solving, but I'm not super interested in becoming a widget designer, being a real engineer. And any success that I had as a teenager had always been in leadership opportunities, and it was mostly athletics.
Yeah.
And I had some summer jobs leading up to that decision that were also non-athletic leadership positions, and I just kind of I was this is what I want to do. I want to lead people. I enjoy, shepherding a team and supporting a team and things like that. And that was really, I think, what drove me to make that decision.
And how long were you in the service for?
I was in the service for about 10 years. Some of that was, during my training.
Yeah.
But like from start to finish, about a decade.
And what skills or, experiences did you have during that time that did any of that help prepare you for your entrepreneurial phase?
Yeah, certainly. Really the one thing I think the Marine Corps in particular of all the services does really well is like, it really is like a leadership polishing academy. People outside the Marine Corps and of course the other services like to make fun of us for being, knuckle dragging, gunslingers, but really the Marine Corps, puts a lot of thought and doctrine and development and training into its leaders. It's really like more so than almost any organization in the world. It really finds its strength in its leadership. So a ton of development, invested into me and my peers, into how to lead people.
And one of the things you mentioned, and we mentioned in your bio too, is that's where you felt like you really developed that leadership philosophy that you have, which was to be a leader that serves the team and not the other way around. Can you talk a little bit more about that philosophy? Yeah,
sure. One thing that was an idea that was introduced to me in the Marine Corps was that that a team is like a tree. So think like an oak tree, right? And, like your Marines or your plumbers or HVAC technicians, right, are at the ends of the branches. They're bearing fruit. They have the nice, pretty leaves. Everyone gawks at them and gives them all the praise. And wow, look at that pretty tree, right? And then the leader is the trunk of the tree. No one's really paying attention to the trunk of the tree, but the trunk of the tree is obviously holding up the rest of the team. It's also funneling it, resources and nutrients, and it's sturdy but still flexible enough to bend in the wind. And you can kind of take this analogy all the way to its end. That's something that I've really latched onto.
Mm-hmm. And where were you stationed throughout your career, and what were your primary responsibilities over those 10 years?
Yeah, so I trained in Quantico. That's like that's all officers go through Quantico. It's so you go through officer candidate school. That's more similar to like a boot camp style, not so fun place to be. and then the basic school is a 6-month training academy that basically you teach. I'm getting mixed up because I ultimately became an instructor at this school. But you learn how to be a basic rifle platoon commander, right? So the Marine Corps is big on everyone, no matter what their job is able to do the dirty work at the pointy end of the spear for the Marine Corps, right? So even if you're a logistics officer, you need to know how to conduct an attack with a platoon. And that's basically, the school basically takes all officers, no matter what specialty, and does that across 6 months. And then I was ultimately selected to be an infantry officer. I went to infantry officer course, also in Quantico. And then I was stationed in Camp Lejeune down in North Carolina. That's where I was a platoon commander, deployed to Eastern Europe back when Russia first invaded Crimea back in like 2016. Romania, Bulgaria, Latvia, Lithuania, sort of like a show of force on the Russian front there for that deployment. And then I came back. I was an operations officer for the battalion. So a platoon is about 50 individuals. That was when I was a platoon commander. A battalion is like 1,000. So I was an assistant operations officer for the battalion. So kind of like planning, training exercises, supporting the battalion, making sure the guys are meeting all of the wickets so that they're ready for their next deployment, things like that. And then I deployed to the Middle East for 12 months.
Wow.
Where I sort of floated. I had a unique job over there, but I sort of floated between different countries, Bahrain, Afghanistan, Kuwait, Qatar. That was a really eye-opening tour. And then I came back and I was an instructor at that course that I mentioned before.
So what was the leap that you took from, you were instructing, you said, but then you've now opened up your own services company.
Yeah, what made you want to go into civilian life and then as an entrepreneur?
Yeah, I wasn't really ready to leave the Marine Corps, so I left in 2020. Yeah. And part of the reason I left is that the previous 4 years, my wife and I had spent geographically separated. She was going to medical school, and I was doing the things I had to do. So, and it was kind of like looking at the path forward. It was like, there's really no way around it. You're going to spend the next 6 years apart too. So it was kind of like, whoa,
right.
We got a strong marriage, but
it's a lot of time apart.
Only so much the separation makes the heart grow fonder, right?
Yeah. So it was time for me to take one for the team. I left the Marine Corps and joined my wife in the civilian world. But leading up to that, I was really conflicted. I didn't know what I wanted to do after the Marine Corps. All sorts of things were on the table. What I knew, though, what I had kind of learned in the Marine Corps and at some jobs that I had prior to the Marine Corps when I was in college, I knew I didn't want to be in like a big corporate bureaucratic setting. And certainly, the Marine Corps is a great place, but it's a big organization, and there are certain corners of that organization that can feel that way. And I had been exposed to them at certain points, and I was like, okay, I definitely don't want to do that. But what I did know is that the times that I was most engaged and most enthusiastic in the Marine Corps was when I was on a small team, far forward, self-sustaining, and just making it happen, That's like, you're getting out of bed just ready to work. Mm-hmm. And so I was like, man, like, where can I find that? And I think a lot of guys leaving the Marine Corps think that they'll never be able to find that outside, right? You leave something like the Marine Corps, and it's just office space out there, And I had read in like the fall of 2019, so like 10 months prior to leaving the Marine Corps, I had read a book called Small Giants by Bo Burlingham. And in that book, basically the whole book is about him featuring 6 or 7 businesses across the U.S. where owners and leadership in these businesses are like really driving their values through the business and into their communities and supporting their team and just doing really amazing things in their communities. And I was like, wow, this sounds like what I'm looking for, like American small business is far forward, small team, figuring it out, high stakes. I was like, okay, American small business sounds great. And I had some context, like prior to the Marine Corps, I had been a plumber's apprentice for 9 months.
Okay.
So I just was familiar with the trades and what it felt like to be in the trades. Mm-hmm. And my hypothesis was that tradesmen would be similar to the Marines that I was used to leading. And like they would take well to the leadership style that I developed in the Marine Corps. So that's the whole thesis right there, right? Not super complex. And it's panned out that way.
So we were just talking about how you transitioned from Marine Corps to civilian life and deciding to go into the trades. But I mean, you could have gone to work for someone else. And what led you to going, I'm going to open my own company?
Part of it, and I realize now that I was wrong about this, but part of it was that I didn't think anyone would hire me.
Huh.
Like for like an operations manager role or something like that. I didn't think that people would see what I felt was true, that like I had value to bring to the trades with my background. I didn't think anyone would believe me, that was me underselling myself and not wanting to, be rejected probably, right? 'Cause I didn't even try. I just decided that was not true. So I was like, well, I guess I got to do this myself. Yeah. So yeah, in 2020, and
let's just context, in the midst of a global pandemic, no less.
Right at the beginning, yeah, pretty
That's
much,
right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So similar to you guys, it's seemingly I had met a master plumber, and he was late career and looking to retire, and I purchased his very small business from him. So that's how I started with three plumbers, and it turns out that a business of that size does not have a whole lot of infrastructure to it.
Right.
So when we first got started, I was basically the manager, owner, apprentice, parts runner, ditch digger,
Dishwasher,
phone answerer.
Hats that come with it, right? The glamour of business ownership.
That's right. Yep.
we say that quite a bit.
Yes. What was that learning curve like for you? To go into being, you're used to being a leader, but I'm sure there must have been some differences between leading in the military and then finding yourself in charge of leading a small company.
Yeah, I mean, in the military, whether you realize it or not, or take it for granted or not, you have a lot of support. Even when you're far forward, right? Someone's like bringing you water and food and ammo and stuff like that, right? You're not necessarily having to do all that yourself and figure it out, and who are you buying it from and where's it coming from and all this. Small business, and you got to figure that out all on your own. So I think that was a little bit of a surprise. And especially, I initially felt comfortable, like, hey, this is a small business, right? We're not taking over something big, complex. This is very small. I've got 3 plumbers I have to lead. That's it. But the reality is, like, actually, business is almost more difficult the smaller it is in some respects. Because like you said, you're wearing so many hats just to get the work done each day.
Right.
And you're having to wear all those hats, those sort of like the business of business hats, the accounting, the purchasing, all this stuff, right? The hiring, the recruiting, and you're doing that all while also being completely immersed in the actual work of the day.
Right.
So that was let's say that was a busy time for me. I spent my entire days were spent in the field, laboring. And then I would spend the after hours, trying to organize the warehouse or decide, how we're going to, a new software we're going to bring on to try to make our lives easier, or who are we going to hire next to try to take get me some of my bandwidth back. Right. And so there were some, very long days and weekends and all that in the very beginning.
So what was that trajectory like to go from yourself and 3 plumbers to, like we said, 5 years later, you're now at 120 employees? That 5-year time span, because bringing on that many employees, you obviously have to have the infrastructure for that. You have to have enough clients, enough work for that to be able to support that amount of employees. So give us a little bit of an insight of what that 5-year span of bringing on that many employees was like.
Yeah, I'd say one of the themes, and this is still true for us now, and it continues to be true, is, you'll notice, like, one thing that was missing from that whole background context is, like, no business school, no corporate business experience, so we've had to self-educate and learn all the way through this thing, right? And things that weren't problems before are problems now, right? Now we have a bigger team. We have to keep them moving, like you mentioned. So, for the past 2 years, I've had to get really educated on, like, how do we build a brand? How do we market? How do we generate leads? When we were growing very quickly and we didn't have the staff, it was like, okay, like, how do we get really good at recruiting? How do we get really good at X, Y, and Z, right? Before I used to be able to just run payroll, from my phone on an app or something for the 3 guys. Now we have like a whole function for that. And what is that supposed to look like? And so these are things that we've just stumbled our way through and just busted through walls head first. But certainly it's been, just when you ask that question, to me, it's like, I just think back to all the, like, self-education we've had to do throughout.
And I know there's often not one turning point, but what was either the processes or different milestones you hit that allowed you to go from being in the weeds of a small business to being able to think strategically and to start growing it? Because that is a big leap that not everyone's able to make.
Definitely. It is hard. And I have, throughout the years, I've made friends with a bunch of people in this business across the country, and a lot of them struggle with the same thing. And for one, I think just one part of it is just sheer force of will and like willingness to work, right? Like that is, that no pulling punches on that. Like
you're
that
the business owner. It gets
falls on
done,
you.
and it doesn't always get done between 9 and 5, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, that's a big part of it. And I think it's just constantly like self-assessing. What are the tasks that are taking up all of my time, and like where are they in like the leverage hierarchy, right? Like just like tedious tasks that like anyone could do. It doesn't have to be me. And then like the next level up and the next level up, all the way up to, strategic thought. So I think the journey has looked like just trying to like shed and delegate those tedious tasks as cash allowed, and sometimes before cash allowed. And like document and train somebody so that oftentimes they can do it better than you because they're actually focused on that thing, whereas you're trying to do it while you're doing 100 other things. So that's largely that's been a big part of it. Is just constantly just what is taking up a significant portion of my time. Is there someone we could hire that and like an appropriate role that could assume this task and do it to an acceptable level?
One of the things that you had mentioned was, you had to focus more on marketing. And we know you recently went through a rebrand of the company. It was originally Sanford Temperature Control, and it's now High Ground Service Pros. What was why did you want to make that change? I know you said it helps better reflect the values that the company has. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think a lot of people in the market probably think I'm out of my mind for doing that.
But it was a name you also inherited. It's correct.
Sanford. Correct.
Sanford was inherited.
Yep, that's right. So there was a little bit of friction just by, holding a name that's not yours and is someone's name, right? I know for the first 2 years owning Sanford, there was always this kind of like, feeling that I had to hide behind the company a little bit, right? That if me as Rich Jordan stepped in front of the company and introduced myself to a homeowner as the owner or something, they'd think that was weird, that this guy whose last name is not Sanford isn't 65 years old or something. Why does he own this company? I ultimately got over that. And really, we really built Sanford into what it became. And then one of the things that kind of pushed us over the edge was we're launching a branch in Southern Maine right now. And, we're kind of faced with this decision of like, all right, we've been thinking about changing this name. It's kind of like, we got to do it now or we're never going to do it. So do we want to continue to grow this company and increase its reach and increase its influence and have it still be under this name that we're not super happy with? And so we decided to make the change. And there was a lot of thought and hemming and hawing over it. I mean, because we had invested a lot of money into the Sanford name as well, and time, and we're proud of what we built at Sanford. And so we really put a lot of thought into it. But we, one of the reasons we changed the name to what it is now, to High Ground, is we have a list of 10 core behaviors at the company, and we've had them for several years now. And the team really leans into these, and these truly drive daily actions. They're not just words on the wall kind of thing. And And one of the things that we're proud, we feel like this is the right way to run a trades business, is that when you as a homeowner call us into your home and you pay us good money and we take care of an issue for you that you probably don't understand all that well, but we kind of educated you on and then we repaired, you have every right to expect that was done right and the decisions were correct. And the craftsmanship and the workmanship was to par. So for us, any time that might not be the case, of course we make mistakes. We make them right at no cost, period. That's a huge part of our value proposition in our business. We have a lifetime workmanship guarantee and we stand behind that. And one of the core behaviors that drives that is seize the high ground. So seize the high ground, do the right thing, even when not easy or profitable. That's one of our 10 core behaviors. And I actually had the team vote out of all 10, what was their top core behavior. Individual, I was just grabbing people. Hey, what's your top core behavior? What's your top core behavior? And seize the high ground came out as the winner. And so now we're here with High Ground Service Pros as the name.
And there's a lot involved in that when you're doing a rebrand. Like you said, you can pick a new name, which in itself is a difficult task, but you've got branding on everything. You've got a website, you've got stationery, you've got every little thing.
So much.
Yeah. So I'm sure you found some things that you didn't even think of that you're like, oh, now this is affecting our rebrand. Mm-hmm. Anything you ran into that surprised you?
There's definitely been every little rock and pebble you turn over has something like that. So I'd say some of the things were certain dominoes couldn't fall before others fell, right? The easy thing is hey, get the graphic designer, pick our colors, pick our name, what's it going to look like? Okay, cool. And even that's kind of the first domino. You have to figure that out. And that took us longer than we wanted. So we're starting to blow timelines on our desired rebrand. And a lot of the web stuff, the web design, new URLs, domains, how does Google handle that? What happens to your web traffic from the old website, and how do you just redirect the old website to the new one? Do you leave the old one? All of these little things, these little tactical things we've had to figure out. Yeah.
It's been a phenomenal success story in these 5 years, but we know from interviewing many entrepreneurs over the years, it's not without mistakes and setbacks and challenges that you have to pick yourself up from, learn from, and move on. What's been the biggest challenge you've had to overcome so far? And how did you get through it?
I think, oh man, that's a good question. I think one of them, unsurprisingly, of course, cash is something we're thinking about constantly, right? Trying to make sure we don't run out and have enough. And, but I think the biggest one and the one that has contributed most to our success is people, and how we hire, how we develop, how we train, and how we build culture, even on a larger team, right? So how do you maintain a palpable culture on a bigger team? And in a 120 person organization with multiple departments and multiple leaders, the web of communication gets extremely complex compared to 3 guys. And how do we do that in a way that doesn't bog us down and turn us into that corporate bureaucracy that I've initially set out to avoid?
Right.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's very obvious that, one of the, over my 26 years with the company and interviewing all kinds of leaders and entrepreneurs and running the best companies to work for competition is that values, are so important to overall success. And in 5 years, it's been, you've had to do a lot of just building, and you made strategic time to also take a step back and think about what kind of company you wanted and what kind of values you wanted to stand for. Why was that a priority for you? And what is the culture you've been creating there? What are the values that have been driving you that you've touched upon?
Yeah, I think this just comes back to, some of my leadership experience, right? Mm-hmm. Like you could build a team that just cares about sales revenue and earnings, right? And maybe you have some fun doing it, and you can celebrate your wins, but it's not something that like really drives the team. So it's like, what is our purpose for being here? Why are we doing what we do, right? And of course, like, we are here to keep the state of New Hampshire warm and cool, and with clean water and electricity, but also like the mission that we landed on a few years ago is give the trades a good home, right? So like really building a workplace that tradesmen and women can enjoy working at, right? Like, enjoy the people they work with, enjoy the problems that they're working on, enjoy how they're treated, how they're led, and ultimately feel like they're developing in a career, not just a job. That's a big part of what drives at least the leadership, right? And certainly, like, we've built we've really imbued like a sense that it's not just the leaders that are driving that, but like everyone is driving it. And like the success that a technician is having today, the lessons that he's learning are contributing to jobs created for the next guy who gets hired next week, next month, next year. That's certainly something that we lean into quite a bit, is like the, American job creation in this market, in this area. And then a big part of what, so a couple of years ago, I was like hiring my first leader, like outside leader, someone I did not know. And that was actually very stress inducing for me, because I care so much about how my people are led, to put some of that responsibility into basically a stranger's hands that I'd interviewed for 40 minutes, and was very nerve-wracking. So I one of my response to that was because two things. One, I wanted to make sure my people were led well by this person, of course. And then I also wanted to make sure that I was giving this person the space to lead in their own style, and that I wasn't going to be some like draconian leader over the leader, right? Because I cared so much and I was going to micromanage. So what I landed on is that, leaders can have stylistic differences, but they have to meet certain standards for leadership. And I wrote out this 2-page document that has about 20 leadership standards. That has been a big part of, especially like as we promote people into leadership roles, and then we develop them in like focused on these standards. And this is what leadership is, right? So you mentioned in the intro, Christine, leaders exist to support the team. That's one of the leadership standards. And so there's various things, right? Like, what kind of urgency does the leader move with? How do they address the team? How do they hold people accountable and things like that? All of these things sort of like address like a holistic leadership standard. And I think that has had like a really tangible impact on the team we have today, and the experience, not just of the leadership, but of the people that are being led.
Obviously, we spent a lot of time talking about your phenomenal growth over 5 years. I know we keep repeating that, but it is amazing. To grow to 120 employees, to grow into new markets, into Southern Maine. So I'm loath to ask this question, but so what's next? What's your vision overall for the company and what you want it to be? Are you there, or is there more to come?
I think right now, so when my team asks me this, right? Because I get this question from my own team sometimes.
I'm sure. Where are we going, boss?
My answer is pretty simple. It's we want to achieve our potential. That's what we want to do. So, and that's in terms of size and influence, but also just quality, and like the nature of our work and how well we're doing it, and the team we have and how happy they are and how engaged they are. So we want to achieve our potential. And so what that looks like, honestly, I don't know. I'm not someone who has, like a fleshed out 10-year plan, we're going to hit this revenue milestone and, hell or high water, So that's really not what it is. We're just putting one foot in front of the other and seeing how far we can get.
Well, congratulations on your success so far. We look forward to seeing where you go next.
Yeah, thank you for having me on today.
Thank you. And once again, our guest today has been Rich Jordan, the founder and CEO of High Ground Service Pros. Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you for joining us today. If you enjoyed the stories and information you heard on today's podcast, find more by subscribing to Business NH Magazine or visiting businessnhmagazine.com. I'm Matt Murray.
And I'm Christine Carrian. Bizcast NH is a production of Granite Media Group.